Welcome, friend, to this peaceful hour where we gently peel back the layers of time. Tonight, our story takes place in a world far removed from ours, but still tenderly human. Whether you're drifting off or just looking to slow the pace of your evening, I'm grateful you're here. I'd love to hear where you're listening from, what city or country, and what time it is as you press play. It always amazes me how history can bring strangers together. If this kind of calm historical storytelling brings you peace, consider subscribing. We have many more stories to lull us into the quiet night. Now, we all complain about modern dating, right? Apps that don't work, ghosting, awkward small talk over overpriced coffee. But imagine if your biggest dating worry wasn't whether someone would text you back, but whether they'd survive the winter. Imagine if meeting the parents meant literally asking permission from a feudal lord who owned your potential partner like property. Or if your idea of romance involved checking each other for open sores and hoping neither of you had been accused of witchcraft recently. The truth is, medieval dating was so brutal that it makes today's worst Tinder horror stories look like fairy tales. We're talking about an era where love was a luxury most couldn't afford, where marriages were business transactions, and where the average person had about as much say in their romantic life as livestock being traded at market. Over the next few parts, we're going to uncover exactly why finding love in medieval times was an absolute nightmare. We'll explore how the rigid class system turned romance into a political chess game, how the Catholic Church controlled every aspect of intimate relationships, and how basic hygiene issues made physical attraction, well, challenging to say the least. But here's what's really shocking. Many of the dating problems we think are uniquely modern actually have their roots in these medieval disasters. The pressure to marry young, medieval invention, arranged relationships. They basically created the template. Even the idea that romance should be this dramatic, tortured experience comes straight from medieval courtly love traditions that were designed to be impossible to fulfill. First, let's talk about something that would make modern dating apps seem like paradise. The complete and utter lack of choice that defined medieval romance. If you think your dating pool is limited now, imagine living in a village of maybe 50 people, where half are related to you, a quarter are already married, and the rest are either too young, too old, or have been claimed by the local lord for political marriages. In medieval society, your romantic options weren't determined by compatibility, shared interests, or even basic attraction. They were determined by your social class, your family's financial situation, and often by people who had never even met you. The idea of dating around, getting to know different people, or heaven forbid, marrying for love, that was not just rare. It was considered dangerous and potentially heretical. For peasants, which made up about 90% of the population, romance was essentially a luxury they couldn't afford. When you're working from sunrise to sunset just to survive, when a bad harvest means your family starves, and when your entire life is controlled by a feudal lord who sees you as barely more than property, finding love becomes a secondary concern to finding someone who can help you not die. Most peasant marriages were arranged by families based on practical considerations. Can this person work the land? Do they come with a dowry of livestock or tools? Are they healthy enough to bear children and work until they drop dead in their 30s? Romance wasn't even part of the equation, because romance was seen as a dangerous distraction from the serious business of survival. And here's where it gets really dark. Even if you did find someone you genuinely cared about, there was no guarantee you'd be allowed to marry them. Feudal lords had the right to approve or deny marriages among their serfs, and they often used this power as a form of control. If you were a productive worker, your lord might refuse to let you marry someone from another village because losing you would hurt his economic interests. But surely the nobility had it better, right? They had wealth, power, and the luxury of choice that peasants could only dream of. Well, not exactly. If anything, Noble marriages were even more calculated and loveless than peasant ones, because the stakes were so much higher. When you're part of the ruling class, your marriage isn't just about your personal happiness. It's about military alliances, territorial control, and political power that could affect thousands of people. Noble children, especially daughters, were essentially treated as valuable trading cards in a complex game of medieval politics. A young noblewoman might find herself betrothed to a man she'd never met, possibly decades older than her, purely because her marriage would secure a military alliance or settle a territorial dispute. Her feelings about this arrangement were not just irrelevant. Expressing dissatisfaction with an arranged marriage could be seen as treason against her family's interests. And let's talk about age, because this is where medieval dating gets truly disturbing by modern standards. The concept of childhood as we understand it didn't really exist in medieval times. Girls were often betrothed as young as 7 years old, with marriages typically consummated when they reached what was considered marriageable age, which was often as young as 12 or 13. These weren't marriages between children, which would have been unusual even then. These were marriages between young girls and often much older men, arranged for political or economic reasons. A 12-year-old girl might find herself married to a 30-year-old man she'd met once at the betrothal ceremony, expected to manage a household, bear children, and navigate complex political relationships while still being, by any reasonable standard, a child herself. The mortality rates tell the whole horrifying story. Many young women died in childbirth, not just because medieval medicine was primitive, but because their bodies simply weren't ready for pregnancy and childbirth. The pressure to produce male heirs meant that surviving a first pregnancy was often followed immediately by attempts at a second, then a third, until either a son was born or the woman died trying. For men, the situation wasn't much better, just different. Young noble men might have slightly more freedom in their romantic choices, but they were still expected to marry for political advantage rather than personal preference. And if they were younger sons with no inheritance prospects, they might be forced into the church, whether they had a religious calling or not, effectively removing them from the marriage market entirely. But here's what makes this even more twisted. The medieval period actually invented the concept of romantic love that still tortures us today. The tradition of courtly love, popularized by troubadours and poets, created this idealized vision of romance that was deliberately designed to be impossible to achieve. Courtly love typically involved a knight falling desperately in love with a married noblewoman, then spending years performing increasingly elaborate acts of devotion while never actually consummating the relationship. This wasn't just entertainment. It was a social safety valve that allowed people to fantasize about passionate romance while maintaining the rigid marriage structures that kept society stable. The problem is, this tradition created the idea that true love should be tortured, impossible, and preferably tragic. It gave us the notion that if love comes too easily, it's not real love. Sound familiar? This medieval invention is still messing with our heads today, making us think that healthy, straightforward relationships are somehow less romantic than dramatic, complicated ones. And we haven't even gotten to the practical horrors yet. Imagine trying to be romantic in a world where most people had never brushed their teeth, where bathing was considered potentially dangerous to your health, and where the average person's idea of perfume was rubbing themselves with herbs to mask the smell of months without washing. Physical attraction, which we take for granted as a basic component of romance, was complicated by the simple fact that most people looked and smelled absolutely terrible by modern standards. Dental hygiene was non-existent, leading to widespread tooth loss and breath that could probably kill small animals. Skin diseases were rampant, from simple acne to serious conditions like scrofula, which caused visible growths and sores. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how the medieval understanding of sexuality and desire was shaped by religious doctrine that viewed physical pleasure as inherently sinful. The Catholic Church taught that sexual desire, even within marriage, was a necessary evil to be endured for the purpose of procreation, not enjoyed. This created a culture where expressing sexual desire, especially for women, was seen as evidence of moral corruption. Women who showed too much interest in physical pleasure were suspected of being in league with the devil. Men were expected to control their desires, but women were expected to barely have any desires at all. The result was a dating culture, if we can even call it that, where the very foundations of romantic attraction, physical chemistry, emotional connection, and shared pleasure were viewed with suspicion and often outright hostility. And this is just the beginning. We haven't even talked about how the church controlled every aspect of romantic relationships, how disease and death made long-term planning impossible, or how the constant threat of violence turned every potential romance into a potential tragedy. Medieval dating wasn't just difficult, it was a nightmare that combined the worst aspects of arranged marriage, religious extremism, and brutal social inequality into a system that treated love as either a dangerous luxury or a useful tool for political control. So the next time you're frustrated with modern dating, remember that at least you get to choose your own partners, express your desires without being accused of witchcraft, and generally expect to live long enough to see how the relationship turns out. Because in medieval times, even those basic freedoms were revolutionary concepts that most people could only dream about. As dawn broke over the cramped villages of medieval Europe, the harsh realities of courtship became even more apparent in the stark light of day. But if you think the social restrictions we discussed were bad, wait until you hear about the physical dangers that came with medieval romance. Because in a world without modern medicine or basic hygiene, even holding hands could literally be a matter of life and death. Picture this. You're a young peasant woman, maybe 15 years old, and you've somehow managed to catch the eye of a local farmer's son. Your families have agreed to let you walk together after church on Sundays, always under the watchful gaze of your mother or aunt, of course. But as you stroll through the village, you're not just navigating the rocky path between the thatched cottages. You're walking through a minefield of disease, filth, and physical dangers that would make modern dating apps seem like a luxury spa experience. The streets beneath your feet aren't paved with cobblestones or even packed dirt. They're flowing rivers of human and animal waste, rotting food scraps, and God knows what else. The smell alone would knock a modern person unconscious. Pigs roam freely, rooting through garbage and relieving themselves wherever they please. Chickens scatter underfoot, leaving their own contributions to the aromatic symphony. And in the summer heat, the stench becomes so overwhelming that people regularly faint just from walking outside. But the smell is the least of your worries. Every step you take is potentially exposing you to deadly diseases that we've completely forgotten about today. Cholera lurks in the contaminated water wells. Dysentery spreads through the poorly prepared food. And typhoid fever can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Black Death might have been the most famous killer of the medieval period, but it was just one player in a whole orchestra of diseases that could end your romantic dreams permanently. Now imagine trying to have an intimate conversation with your potential suitor while navigating this biological wasteland. You can't exactly lean in close for a romantic whisper when the person next to you might be carrying any number of infectious diseases, and forget about that cute habit of sharing food or drinks. In medieval times, sharing a cup of ale with your beloved wasn't romantic, it was Russian roulette. The lack of basic dental hygiene meant that getting close enough for a kiss was an assault on all your senses. Without toothbrushes, toothpaste, or any understanding of oral hygiene, most people's breath was absolutely revolting. Teeth rotted out of people's heads by their 20s. Gums bled constantly, and the smell of decay was so common that it was just accepted as a normal part of human interaction. But let's say you're brave enough to overlook the apocalyptic state of medieval hygiene. Let's say you found someone whose company you genuinely enjoy, despite the fact that they smell like a combination of barnyard animals and rotting vegetables. You still have to contend with the physical dangers that lurked around every corner. Medieval towns and villages were not built with safety in mind. Buildings collapsed regularly because construction standards were basically non-existent. Fire was a constant threat because everything was made of wood and thatch, and people cooked over open flames inside their homes. A romantic evening by the firelight could quickly turn into a desperate fight for survival if a spark caught the wrong piece of straw. And then there were the human dangers. Medieval society was incredibly violent, and that violence wasn't restricted to battlefields or tavern brawls. Domestic violence was not only common, it was legally protected. A husband could beat his wife with virtually no consequences, as long as he didn't kill her outright. Women had no legal recourse, no shelters to flee to, and no economic independence that would allow them to escape abusive relationships. Even if your romantic interest seemed kind and gentle during your carefully supervised courtship, there was no way to know what kind of person they would become once you were legally bound to them. Marriage was a permanent contract with no escape clause, and many women discovered too late that their husbands were violent, cruel, or simply indifferent to their well-being. The physical act of intimacy itself was fraught with dangers that we can barely comprehend today. Without any understanding of sexual health or reproduction, without contraception or proper medical care, every romantic encounter was potentially life-threatening. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval populations, causing everything from painful sores to madness to death. For women, pregnancy was essentially a death sentence waiting to happen. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. It's estimated that between 1 in 10 and 1 in 4 women died in childbirth, and those who survived often suffered from complications that plagued them for the rest of their lives. Imagine trying to enjoy your wedding night, knowing that every act of intimacy could lead to a pregnancy that might kill you. And if you did survive childbirth, you'd likely face it again and again. Without reliable contraception, most married women were pregnant almost constantly from their wedding day until menopause or death, whichever came first. The average medieval woman who survived to adulthood could expect to give birth to 6 or 7 children, though many of those children wouldn't survive their first year. The infant mortality rate was so high that parents often didn't even name their children until they were several months old, because the chances of the baby dying were simply too great to risk the emotional attachment. Imagine the psychological toll of losing child after child, of never knowing if this pregnancy would be the one that killed you, of watching your body break down from the constant cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. But even if you managed to navigate all these physical dangers, even if you found a partner who was kind and gentle, even if you survived multiple pregnancies and childbirth, you still had to contend with the simple, brutal fact that life in medieval times was short and unpredictable. The average life expectancy was somewhere between 30 and 40 years old. This wasn't because people aged faster, but because so many died young from disease, violence, or accidents that it dragged down the average. If you were lucky enough to survive childhood, you might live to see 50 or 60, but you'd be considered ancient by medieval standards. This meant that most romantic relationships were tragically brief. You might marry at 15 and be widowed by 25. You might finally find true love only to watch your partner waste away from a disease that would be easily treatable today. The constant presence of death cast a shadow over every relationship, every moment of happiness. And yet, despite all these overwhelming obstacles, despite the disease and violence and early death, people still fell in love. They still wrote poetry and sang songs about their beloved. They still risked everything for a chance at happiness, however brief it might be. In some ways, this makes medieval romance more poignant, not less. When life was so uncertain, and death was always lurking just around the corner, every moment of connection, every gentle touch, every shared smile became infinitely precious. People didn't have the luxury of taking love for granted because they knew how quickly it could be snatched away. But it also meant that romantic relationships were often desperate and intense in ways that we might find uncomfortable today. When you might only have a few years together, when pregnancy could be a death sentence, when disease could strike at any moment, love became a high-stakes gamble with everything on the line. The physical dangers of medieval dating weren't just inconveniences or minor health risks. They were existential threats that shaped every aspect of how people approached romance and relationships. The very act of falling in love was an act of incredible courage in the face of overwhelming odds. As we continue our journey through the nightmare of medieval dating, we'll explore how these physical dangers combined with social restrictions and economic realities to create a system of courtship that was unlike anything we can imagine today. Because if you think dodging diseases and death was challenging, wait until you hear about the economic factors that could make or break a medieval romance before it even began. Why dating was a nightmare in medieval times, Part 3. But while clan warfare, church oppression, and social constraints made daily life unbearable, perhaps nowhere was medieval brutality more apparent than in the realm of romance and relationships. If you thought modern dating was complicated, imagine trying to find love in an era where a simple kiss could literally kill you, where marriages were business transactions, and where the very act of courtship was governed by a toxic mix of religious zealotry and aristocratic manipulation. The medieval approach to love and marriage was so fundamentally twisted that it would make even the most dysfunctional modern relationship look like a fairy tale. This wasn't just about arranged marriages or lack of choice. This was a systematic destruction of human intimacy, wrapped in the false promise of chivalric romance and divine blessing. Let's start with the most basic element of any romantic relationship: physical attraction and intimacy. In medieval times, even the slightest physical contact between unmarried individuals was considered a grave sin that could damn your soul for eternity. The Catholic Church had turned human sexuality into something so shameful and terrifying that people genuinely believed a passionate kiss might send them straight to hell. But it wasn't just religious guilt that made physical intimacy dangerous. It was literally life-threatening. Without any understanding of hygiene or disease transmission, intimate contact was a game of Russian roulette. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval society, and there was no treatment, no cure, and often no understanding of how these ailments spread. Syphilis, which arrived in Europe during the late medieval period, was particularly devastating. The disease would eat away at people's faces, leaving them hideously disfigured before driving them insane and ultimately killing them. Imagine trying to build a romantic relationship when physical intimacy carried the very real risk of a slow, agonizing death. For women, the dangers were even more extreme. Pregnancy was essentially a death sentence that you might survive. Maternal mortality rates were astronomical, with some estimates suggesting that 1 in 3 women died during childbirth. This wasn't just about lack of medical knowledge. Medieval society actively made pregnancy more dangerous through their beliefs and practices. Medieval medical texts claimed that women were essentially defective men, with bodies that were cold and wet rather than hot and dry. This fundamental misunderstanding of female anatomy meant that medical treatments for pregnant women were often harmful or deadly. Physicians might prescribe bloodletting to balance the humors, or recommend herbs that were actually toxic to developing fetuses. The church made things worse by teaching that the pain of childbirth was God's punishment for Eve's original sin. This meant that attempts to ease labor pain were considered blasphemous. Women were expected to suffer in agony as a form of divine penance, and any attempt to reduce their pain was seen as interfering with God's will. But let's say you survived courtship, avoided disease, and made it through pregnancy alive. The actual structure of medieval marriage was designed to crush any possibility of genuine love or partnership. Marriage wasn't about two people choosing each other. It was a business transaction between families, with the bride as the commodity being traded. Fathers would negotiate bride prices and dowries like they were selling livestock. The bride herself had no say in the matter. She might meet her husband for the first time on her wedding day, or worse, she might be married to a man she found repulsive or terrifying. Her feelings, her desires, her hopes for the future were completely irrelevant. The age at which these marriage negotiations began was particularly horrifying. Girls as young as 7 years old could be betrothed, and marriages were often consummated when the bride reached 12 or 13. These weren't marriages between children and other children. These were often arrangements between young girls and much older men, sometimes men old enough to be their grandfathers. Consider the case of Margaret Beaufort, who was married for the first time at age 6. She was widowed at age 7, remarried at age 9, and gave birth to her only child, the future King Henry VII, when she was just 13 years old. The traumatic birth left her unable to have more children and caused lifelong health problems. This wasn't unusual. This was the normal experience for noble women. For peasant women, the situation was different, but no less awful. While they might have slightly more say in their marriages, their options were still severely limited by economic necessity and social pressure. A peasant woman who remained unmarried was essentially condemned to a life of poverty and vulnerability. She had no legal rights, no means of supporting herself, and no protection from violence or exploitation. The economic realities of medieval life meant that marriages were primarily about survival rather than love. Families needed to pool resources to have any hope of making it through famines, diseases, and the constant threat of violence. Romance was a luxury that most people simply couldn't afford. Even among the nobility, where there was theoretically more freedom and resources, the political implications of marriage made genuine love nearly impossible. Noble marriages were diplomatic alliances designed to secure territory, forge military partnerships, or end conflicts between warring families. The personal happiness of the bride and groom was irrelevant compared to these larger political considerations. This led to the bizarre medieval concept of courtly love, which was essentially a systematic romanticization of adultery. Since marriages were political arrangements rather than love matches, the only way to experience passionate romance was through affairs. Courtly love literature celebrated these extramarital relationships, creating an entire culture that worshipped forbidden love while simultaneously condemning it. The stories of courtly love were filled with impossible, tragic romances. Knights would pledge their eternal devotion to married ladies, pine away for love they could never have, and perform great deeds in honor of women they could never touch. These weren't stories about healthy relationships. These were fantasies about the very impossibility of love in medieval society. Take the story of Lancelot and Guinevere, which became one of the most famous examples of courtly love. Lancelot, the greatest knight of the Round Table, falls desperately in love with Queen Guinevere, who is married to his lord and friend, King Arthur. Their love is presented as noble and pure, precisely because it can never be consummated without destroying everything they both hold dear. The story ends in tragedy, with their forbidden love ultimately leading to the downfall of Camelot itself. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a reflection of the fundamental impossibility of combining love and marriage in medieval society. The very concept of romantic love was associated with tragedy, impossibility, and destruction. Love was something that happened outside of marriage, and marriage was something that happened without love. The Church's teachings about sexuality made this situation even worse. Medieval Christianity had a deeply conflicted relationship with human sexuality. On one hand, marriage was considered a sacrament blessed by God. On the other hand, sexual desire was seen as inherently sinful, even within marriage. Church doctrine taught that the only acceptable reason for marital sex was procreation. Any sexual activity that was done for pleasure, even between married couples, was considered sinful. This meant that even the most legitimate, church-sanctioned relationships were poisoned by guilt and shame around physical intimacy. Medieval penitential manuals, which provided guidelines for confessors, contained incredibly detailed lists of sexual sins and their appropriate punishments. These texts reveal an obsession with controlling and regulating every aspect of human sexuality. Married couples were told exactly which sexual positions were acceptable, which days of the week they could have sex, and how they should feel about it. The church taught that women who enjoyed sex were particularly sinful, as this suggested they were controlled by their base animal nature rather than their spiritual nature. This created an impossible situation for women, who were expected to participate in sexual activity for reproduction, but were condemned if they found any pleasure in it. Men weren't exempt from this sexual shame either. Medieval Christianity promoted the idea that truly holy men should be celibate, like priests and monks. This meant that even married men were seen as spiritually inferior to those who had renounced sexual activity entirely. Marriage was presented as a kind of spiritual compromise for those who were too weak to achieve true holiness. This toxic approach to sexuality had devastating effects on medieval relationships. Couples were taught to approach physical intimacy with shame and guilt rather than joy and connection. The church's obsession with sexual purity created a culture where natural human desires were seen as evidence of moral failure. The legal status of women in medieval society made genuine partnership between spouses virtually impossible. Under medieval law, women were essentially property. First, they belonged to their fathers, then to their husbands. They couldn't own property, make contracts, or even appear in court without male representation. This legal framework meant that marriage wasn't a partnership between equals. It was a transfer of ownership. A woman's role was to be obedient to her husband, produce heirs, and manage the household. Her own thoughts, feelings, and desires were legally irrelevant. Medieval marriage ceremonies reflected this property-based understanding of the relationship. The bride's father would literally hand her over to the groom, symbolically transferring ownership. The bride herself often had no speaking role in the ceremony. She was present as the object being transferred, not as an active participant in creating a new relationship. The concept of marital rape didn't exist in medieval law, because wives were considered to have given permanent consent to sexual activity when they married. A husband could force himself on his wife whenever he wanted, and she had no legal recourse. This wasn't seen as violence or abuse. It was seen as a husband exercising his legitimate rights over his property. Domestic violence was similarly normalized and legally protected. Medieval law explicitly gave husbands the right to physically discipline their wives, as long as they didn't cause permanent injury or death. The phrase rule of thumb allegedly comes from the medieval legal principle that a man could beat his wife with a stick as long as it was no thicker than his thumb. Women who tried to escape abusive marriages faced enormous obstacles. Divorce was nearly impossible to obtain, and even when it was granted, divorced women lost access to their children and any financial support. A woman who left her husband was essentially choosing homelessness and destitution over abuse. The few options available to women who wanted to escape marriage were themselves problematic. Becoming a nun was one alternative, but this required a substantial dowry and meant giving up any possibility of romantic love or motherhood. Some women chose to become anchoresses, walling themselves up in tiny cells attached to churches and spending the rest of their lives in prayer and isolation. For peasant women, even these limited options weren't available. They couldn't afford the dowries required to enter convents, and they couldn't survive without the economic protection that marriage provided. They were trapped in a system that offered them no real choices and no escape from relationships that might be violent, loveless, or both. The medical understanding of love and attraction in medieval times was equally horrifying. Medieval physicians believed that love was essentially a form of mental illness. They called it lovesickness or heroic love, and they treated it as a dangerous medical condition that needed to be cured. According to medieval medical theory, falling in love caused an imbalance in the body's humors, leading to symptoms like loss of appetite, sleeplessness, and obsessive thoughts about the beloved. Physicians prescribed treatments that included bloodletting, purging, and even surgery to cure patients of their romantic feelings. Some medical texts suggested that lovesickness was caused by looking too intensely at an attractive person, allowing their image to become lodged in the lover's brain like a physical object. The recommended treatment was to avoid the beloved entirely and focus the mind on other things, essentially treating love like an addiction that needed to be overcome. This medicalization of romantic feelings meant that even the experience of falling in love was pathologized and treated as a problem to be solved rather than an emotion to be celebrated. Young people who showed signs of romantic attachment were often subjected to medical interventions designed to cure them of their feelings. The economic realities of medieval life created additional obstacles to romantic relationships. For most people, simply surviving was a full-time occupation that left little time or energy for courtship. Peasants worked from dawn to dusk just to produce enough food to stay alive. They couldn't afford the luxury of extended courtship rituals or romantic gestures. Even when peasants did marry for love, their relationships were constantly strained by the brutal realities of medieval life. Chronic hunger, disease, and the threat of violence created enormous stress on marriages. Couples might go months without adequate food, watching their children waste away from malnutrition while being powerless to help them. The high infant mortality rate meant that most couples would experience the death of multiple children. Some estimates suggest that up to half of all children died before reaching adulthood. This constant grief and loss created enormous emotional strain on marriages, as couples struggled to cope with repeated trauma while still trying to maintain their relationship. The seasonal nature of medieval agricultural life created additional stress on relationships. During harvest time, couples might work 18 hours a day for weeks on end, with no time for intimacy or connection. During winter, they might be trapped together in tiny, cold hovels with nothing to do but wait for spring, creating tension and conflict from forced proximity. For the nobility, the pressures were different, but equally destructive to romantic relationships. Noble marriages were constantly scrutinized for their political implications. Couples couldn't express affection publicly without it being interpreted as a political statement. A noble wife who appeared too happy with her husband might be seen as supporting his political faction, potentially making her a target for his enemies. The elaborate rituals of courtly life also created barriers to genuine intimacy. Noble couples were rarely alone together, surrounded constantly by servants, courtiers, and political advisors. Even their most private moments were subject to political interpretation and social scrutiny. The concept of romantic love, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist in medieval society. The idea that marriage should be based on mutual affection, shared interests, and emotional compatibility was completely foreign. Marriage was about duty, survival, and political alliance. Love, if it existed at all, was something that might develop after marriage, not something that should precede it. This doesn't mean that medieval people didn't experience deep emotions or form strong attachments. But these feelings were not considered a valid basis for major life decisions like marriage. Personal happiness was seen as less important than family honor, social stability, and religious duty. The literature of the period reflects this understanding of love as something dangerous and disruptive. In medieval stories, love typically leads to tragedy, madness, or death. Characters who follow their hearts rather than their duties are usually punished for their choices. The message was clear. Romantic love was a destructive force that should be suppressed in favor of more practical considerations. Even the rare examples of apparently happy medieval marriages were often built on foundations that would be considered problematic today. The famous love letters between Abelard and Eloise, for example, began when Abelard was Heloise's teacher and she was his teenage student. Their relationship involved significant power imbalances and age differences that would be considered inappropriate by modern standards. The medieval understanding of consent was also fundamentally different from modern concepts. The idea that both parties needed to freely and enthusiastically agree to sexual activity was not recognized. Women were expected to submit to their husbands' desires regardless of their own feelings. Men were taught that women's protests were often insincere and that persistence was a virtue. This created a culture where sexual coercion was normalized and even romanticized. Medieval literature is filled with stories of men who win women through persistence, trickery, or force. These stories were presented as romantic rather than disturbing, reflecting a society that didn't recognize women's right to sexual autonomy. The religious framework surrounding marriage also created impossible expectations for medieval couples. Marriage was supposed to be a sacred bond that reflected the relationship between Christ and the Church. This put enormous pressure on couples to maintain an appearance of perfect harmony, even when their relationships were troubled. At the same time, the Church taught that earthly relationships were inherently inferior to spiritual ones. Married couples were told that their love for each other should always be secondary to their love for God. This created a built-in hierarchy that undermined the foundation of their relationships. The Church's emphasis on the afterlife also affected how people approached their marriages. Since earthly life was seen as temporary and relatively unimportant compared to eternal salvation, there was less incentive to work on improving relationships or resolving conflicts. Suffering in marriage was often seen as spiritually beneficial, a form of penance that would be rewarded in heaven. Medieval society's obsession with social hierarchy created additional barriers to romantic relationships. People were expected to marry within their social class, and relationships that crossed class boundaries were heavily discouraged or forbidden. This severely limited the pool of potential partners and often forced people into incompatible matches. Even within the same social class, families were concerned with maintaining or improving their status through marriage. This meant that personal compatibility was less important than factors like wealth, land ownership, and family connections. A couple might be perfectly suited to each other emotionally but forbidden to marry because their union wouldn't advance their family's interests. The elaborate rules governing courtship and marriage also made it difficult for people to get to know each other before committing to a lifetime together. Unmarried men and women were rarely allowed to spend time alone together, and their interactions were heavily supervised and regulated. This meant that couples often entered marriage as virtual strangers. The physical living conditions of medieval life created additional challenges for romantic relationships. Most people lived in small, crowded spaces with little privacy. Peasant families often shared single-room houses with their livestock, while even noble households were crowded with servants and retainers. The lack of privacy made it difficult for couples to develop intimate connections or work through relationship problems. The constant threat of violence in medieval society also affected relationships. Men were expected to be warriors, ready to fight and die for their lords at any moment. This meant that women lived with the constant fear that their husbands might not return from the next battle or raid. The uncertainty made it difficult to plan for the future or invest emotionally in relationships. For women, the threat of sexual violence was constant and pervasive. During times of war, rape was considered a normal part of conquest. Even during peacetime, women had little protection from sexual assault, especially if they were from lower social classes. This created a culture of fear that made it difficult for women to feel safe in their relationships with men. The medieval legal system provided little recourse for victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. Women who accused men of rape were often not believed, and even when they were, the punishments were usually light. The legal system was designed to protect male authority and property rights, rather than individual safety or well-being. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval life, the prospects for finding genuine love and happiness in romantic relationships were nearly non-existent. The combination of religious oppression, social constraints, economic pressures, medical ignorance, legal inequality, and constant physical danger created a perfect storm of relationship dysfunction. Medieval dating wasn't just difficult or challenging, it was a systematic assault on human intimacy and connection. The very institutions that were supposed to support and protect relationships, the church, the legal system, the family structure, were designed in ways that made genuine love and partnership virtually impossible. When we look back at the medieval period, we often focus on the grand narratives of kings and battles, of cathedral building and crusades. But for the vast majority of people living through this era, the most fundamental human experience, the search for love and companionship, was corrupted by forces beyond their control. The medieval approach to romance created generations of people who were taught to fear their own desires, distrust their own feelings, and accept loveless relationships as normal and even virtuous. It's a sobering reminder of how social systems can shape and distort the most basic human experiences, and how far we've come in recognizing the fundamental right to love and be loved freely. Looking at your script summary and the reference videos, I'll continue with part 4, focusing on the complex dynamics of medieval relationships and the dangerous pursuit of love in an era where romance could literally be deadly. But even for those fortunate enough to find love within the confines of marriage, the medieval world presented countless threats to romantic happiness. Disease was perhaps the cruelest enemy of all lasting relationships. The average lifespan hovered around 30 years, meaning that most couples could expect their unions to be cut tragically short. A husband might watch helplessly as his wife succumbed to childbirth complications, or a bride might find herself widowed before her 20th birthday, when plague swept through their village. The Black Death alone destroyed millions of families across Europe. Imagine the horror of watching your beloved develop the telltale black swellings, knowing that within days they would be gone forever. Chronicles from the period describe entire households wiped out, leaving only empty beds and broken hearts. In some villages, so many died that there weren't enough survivors left to bury the dead properly. But disease wasn't the only threat stalking medieval lovers. Violence was a constant spectre hanging over every relationship. Wars between kingdoms, feuds between noble houses, and simple banditry could tear couples apart at any moment. A young man might ride off to fight in his lord's army, promising to return to his sweetheart, only to fall on some distant battlefield. His beloved would wait and hope, perhaps for years, never knowing if he was alive or dead. The story of Eleanor and Thomas illustrates this tragic reality perfectly. Eleanor was the daughter of a minor lord, promised in marriage to secure a political alliance. But she had fallen deeply in love with Thomas, a knight in her father's service. Their secret meetings in the castle gardens were the stuff of troubadour songs, stolen kisses beneath the moonlight, whispered promises of eternal devotion, dreams of somehow being together despite the impossible circumstances. When Thomas volunteered to join a crusade to the Holy Land, Eleanor begged him not to go, but his honor demanded it. And besides, he hoped that distinguishing himself in battle might somehow earn him the right to ask for her hand. They spent one last night together before his departure, making vows that only God could witness. Thomas never returned. Word came back that he had died of fever in some foreign land, his body buried in unmarked ground far from home. Eleanor was forced to marry her intended betrothed as planned, but those who knew her said she never smiled again. She bore her husband 3 children and lived to see grandchildren, but part of her had died with Thomas in that distant desert. Such stories were heartbreakingly common in medieval times. Love was a luxury that few could afford to pursue, and even fewer could hope to keep. The harsh realities of life in this brutal era meant that happiness was always temporary, always under threat from forces beyond anyone's control. For the peasant classes, the situation was even more dire. A farmer's wife might lose her husband to accident, disease, or simple exhaustion from backbreaking labor. Without his protection and income, she would face destitution unless she could quickly remarry. But finding a new husband while caring for young children was no easy task. Many widows were forced to beg, steal, or sell themselves just to survive. The church offered little comfort to those suffering from broken hearts. In fact, religious doctrine taught that earthly love was a distraction from divine devotion. Priests preached that too much affection for one's spouse could damn the soul, as it took attention away from proper worship of God. Marriages were meant to be partnerships for survival and procreation, not unions of passion and romance. This created a terrible paradox for medieval couples. The very emotions that made life bearable, love, desire, joy in each other's company, were considered spiritually dangerous. Husbands and wives were expected to care for each other, but not too much. They could find comfort in companionship, but passionate love was seen as a sin that needed to be confessed and atoned for. The troubadour tradition of courtly love only made things worse for actual married couples. These elaborate fantasies of noble knights wooing unattainable ladies created impossible standards for real relationships. How could an exhausted farmer, competing with ploughing fields, measure up to the romantic ideals sung about in great halls? How could his wife, worn down by childbirth and endless labour, feel beautiful when compared to the ethereal maidens of poetry? The gap between romantic fantasy and harsh reality was enormous. While minstrels sang of eternal devotion and pure love, actual couples struggled just to keep their families fed and alive. Romance was a privilege of the wealthy and idle, not something ordinary people could afford to indulge in. Even physical intimacy was fraught with danger and shame. The church taught that sexual desire, even between married couples, was inherently sinful. Intercourse was only permissible for procreation, and even then, it should be approached with reluctance and minimal pleasure. Couples were forbidden from intimacy during Lent, Advent, feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. When you calculated all the prohibited times, married couples were only supposed to be intimate for about 40 days per year. But perhaps most tragically of all, the constant threat of death meant that opening one's heart to love also meant accepting inevitable, devastating loss. In a world where children regularly died before their 5th birthday, where plague could strike without warning, where violence lurked around every corner, loving someone deeply was an act of extraordinary courage. Medieval people learned to guard their hearts out of necessity. Getting too attached to anyone, spouse, child, parent, friend, was a recipe for unbearable grief. Yet somehow, despite all these obstacles and dangers, love persisted. People continued to fall for each other, to risk everything for stolen moments of happiness, to build lives together, knowing how fragile and temporary they might be. The letters and poems that survive from this period reveal the same longing, passion, and heartbreak that humans have always experienced. A merchant writing to his wife during a long journey, a mother mourning a child lost to fever, a young couple planning their future together. Their words echo across the centuries, reminding us that beneath all the harsh realities of medieval life beat hearts that loved just as deeply as our own. As we reflect on these long-ago lovers, separated by death, duty, and circumstance, we can appreciate how fortunate we are to live in an age where love has a real chance to flourish, where medical care can extend our time together, where communication can bridge any distance, where we're free to choose our own partners and follow our hearts. The medieval world was indeed a nightmare for those seeking love, but their courage in loving anyway, despite impossible odds, perhaps makes their stories all the more beautiful and heartbreaking. Looking at the reference materials and your script summary, I'll continue the medieval dating narrative with part 5, focusing on the brutal realities of courtship and marriage in this harsh era. Yet even as love struggled to survive amid such brutality, the very act of courtship itself presented dangers that modern romantics could scarcely imagine. For in medieval times, the simple pursuit of affection could lead to violence, scandal, or even death. Consider the treacherous world of medieval matchmaking, where marriages were arranged like military alliances, and courtship was a battlefield of competing interests. Young men seeking a bride faced not just the challenge of winning a woman's heart, but navigating a labyrinth of family politics that could turn deadly at a moment's notice. A poorly chosen romantic gesture or an unauthorized advance could spark blood feuds that lasted generations. The story of Thomas de Ashby illustrates these perils perfectly. A minor knight's son in 14th century England, Thomas fell deeply in love with Margaret, the daughter of a rival family. Their secret courtship seemed innocent enough. Stolen glances across the manor hall, whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves, the exchange of small tokens of affection. But when Margaret's father discovered their romance, he flew into a murderous rage. To him, his daughter's heart was not her own to give, but a valuable commodity to be traded for political advantage. Thomas had committed an unforgivable sin, attempting to steal what rightfully belonged to another man's negotiations. The enraged father challenged Thomas to single combat, and in the brutal melee that followed, both men lay dying in the mud, their blood mingling with the autumn rain. Margaret, the object of their affection, was married off within the month to a man 3 times her age, her own desires as irrelevant as morning mist. Such tragedies were commonplace in an era where love was viewed as a dangerous disruption to carefully laid plans. Young people learned early that their hearts were not their own, that romantic feelings were luxuries the practical world could not afford. The very language of medieval courtship reflected this harsh reality. A man did not woo a woman, he negotiated for her. Parents did not consider their children's happiness, they calculated dowries and bloodlines. Even when families approved of a match, the actual process of medieval courtship was fraught with peculiar dangers and bizarre customs that seem almost comical today, yet were deadly serious then. Take the practice of bundling, common in colder regions, where courting couples were encouraged to share a bed while fully clothed, sometimes with a wooden board placed between them. The theory was that this allowed intimate conversation while preserving virtue, but in practice, it led to countless scandals, unwanted pregnancies, and shotgun weddings that began in resentment rather than love. The medieval obsession with virginity created its own nightmarish complications for young lovers. Women lived under constant surveillance, their every move scrutinized for signs of impropriety. A simple conversation with a man could ruin a woman's reputation forever, while actual physical intimacy before marriage could result in public shaming, exile, or worse. The pressure was so intense that some women resorted to dangerous herbal concoctions or primitive surgical procedures to fake their virginity on their wedding night, risking death from infection or poisoning. Men faced their own brutal expectations. They were required to prove their worthiness through displays of martial prowess that often ended in crippling injury or death. tournaments, supposedly chivalrous affairs, were in reality blood-soaked spectacles where young knights died trying to impress their beloveds. The romantic ideal of the knight-errant, wandering the land in search of adventure to prove his love, was built on a foundation of very real corpses. The economic realities of medieval marriage added another layer of cruelty to romantic pursuits. Love matches were seen as selfish indulgences that weakened family fortunes and destabilized social order. A peasant who married for love might find himself cast out by his lord, left to starve with his beloved. A noble who defied his family's wishes could be disinherited, stripped of lands and title, reduced to beggary overnight. The church, supposedly the guardian of marriage as a sacred institution, often made courtship even more treacherous with its labyrinthine rules about who could marry whom. Complex laws governing blood relations meant that couples might discover, sometimes years into their relationship, that they were too closely related to wed. The dispensations required to overcome such obstacles were expensive and time-consuming, available only to the wealthy and well-connected. Religious festivals, ostensibly times of joy and celebration, became hunting grounds for predatory men seeking to exploit the temporary relaxation of social boundaries. Young women attending church gatherings or village fairs faced constant threats of assault or abduction. Many families kept their daughters virtually imprisoned during such events, viewing the risk of social interaction as simply too great. Even successful courtships that led to approved marriages were shadowed by the grim statistics of medieval life. The bride and groom exchanging vows could reasonably expect that one of them would be dead within a decade, victim of disease, childbirth complications, or violence. Wedding celebrations had an undertone of desperate urgency, as if the participants knew they were racing against time itself. The wedding night, supposedly the culmination of courtship, was often a traumatic ordeal, especially for young brides who might be completely ignorant of what awaited them. In an age without effective contraception, pregnancy was almost inevitable, and with it came a terrifying mortality rate. For many women, marriage was quite literally a death sentence, delivered with flowers and music. Those who survived the early years of marriage found that medieval domestic life offered little respite from danger. Domestic violence was not just tolerated, but legally sanctioned. Husbands had the right to chastise their wives with physical force, and the line between discipline and abuse was drawn by the husband alone. Women who complained too loudly about their treatment might find themselves accused of witchcraft or adultery, charges that could result in execution. The isolation of medieval households meant that abused spouses had little recourse and nowhere to flee. Extended family members were often more concerned with maintaining family honor than protecting vulnerable relatives. The church preached submission and endurance, offering the cold comfort that suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Children born of these troubled unions faced their own romantic doom. Raised in households where love was rare and violence common, they learned early that relationships were about power and survival rather than affection and companionship. The cycle of loveless, brutal marriages perpetuated itself generation after generation, creating a society where genuine intimacy was almost impossible to achieve. Yet perhaps most tragically of all, there were those who did find true love in this harsh world, only to watch helplessly as circumstances beyond their control tore them apart. Star-crossed lovers separated by war, plague, or family feuds became the stuff of legend, precisely because their stories resonated with so many who had experienced similar heartbreak. The literature of the period is filled with tales of lovers who chose death rather than separation, Romeo and Juliet being merely the most famous example of a theme that appeared countless times in medieval romance. These stories spoke to a deep human longing for connection that even the brutal realities of medieval life could not entirely extinguish. As we reflect on this catalogue of romantic horrors, it becomes clear that dating was indeed a nightmare in medieval times. A dangerous game played with hearts and lives in a world that offered little protection for the vulnerable and even less tolerance for the inconvenient demands of love. The next time we complain about the complexities of modern romance, perhaps we should spare a thought for our ancestors, who faced not just broken hearts, but broken bones, exile and death in their pursuit of human connection. Why dating was a nightmare in medieval times. Part 6. Now, if you thought the rigid marriage arrangements and brutal customs we've explored were the worst of medieval romance, we're about to delve into something even more disturbing. Because beyond the social restrictions and political machinations lay a web of superstitions, religious hysteria, and paranormal beliefs that turn the simple act of falling in love into a potential death sentence. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval cottage, a young woman named Isabel carefully braided herbs into her hair, whispering ancient words her grandmother had taught her. She wasn't casting spells or communing with dark forces. She was simply trying to attract the attention of Thomas, the blacksmith's son, using folk remedies that had been passed down through generations of village women. But in an age where the line between medicine and magic was razor thin, such innocent actions could easily be misconstrued as witchcraft. The medieval world was absolutely saturated with supernatural beliefs that directly impacted romantic relationships. Love itself was often viewed through a lens of suspicion and fear. If someone fell suddenly and passionately in love, it might be attributed to love potions, enchantments, or demonic influence rather than natural attraction. Women in particular were seen as susceptible to supernatural manipulation, and any woman who displayed unusual beauty, intelligence, or independence risked being branded as a witch or sorceress. The Church's teachings on sexuality created an atmosphere of terror around physical desire. Lust was considered one of the 7 deadly sins, and any intense romantic or sexual feeling could be interpreted as evidence of demonic possession or corruption. This meant that the very emotions that draw people together were treated as dangerous spiritual threats. Young people were taught to be deeply suspicious of their own feelings, creating a psychological minefield around the development of romantic relationships. Consider the plight of a young man named Edmund, who lived in 14th century England. When he found himself powerfully attracted to a local merchant's daughter, he didn't celebrate these feelings or see them as natural human emotions. Instead, he was tormented by the possibility that his desires were sinful, that he was being tempted by Satan, or that the woman herself might be using supernatural means to ensnare him. This kind of psychological torture was commonplace, turning what should have been joyous romantic awakening into a source of guilt, fear, and spiritual crisis. The belief in love magic was both widespread and dangerous. It was commonly accepted that certain individuals, particularly older women, with knowledge of herbs and folk remedies, could create potions and spells to influence romantic feelings. While some of these beliefs led to harmless folk practices, they also created a climate where women could be accused of witchcraft for the most innocent actions. A woman who was skilled in herbalism, who lived alone, or who was simply disliked by her neighbors, could find herself facing accusations of using supernatural powers to manipulate men's affections. The witch trials that plagued Europe from the 15th through 17th centuries had a devastating impact on romantic relationships. Women lived in constant fear that their actions, words, or even their appearance might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural powers. This created an atmosphere of suspicion and terror that poisoned relationships between men and women. Men were taught to be wary of women who were too beautiful, too intelligent, or too independent, as these qualities might indicate supernatural influence. The legal system provided no protection for those accused of love magic or witchcraft. The burden of proof was often reversed, requiring the accused to prove their innocence rather than requiring accusers to prove guilt. Confessions were extracted through torture, and the methods used to identify witches were based on superstition rather than evidence. A woman might be condemned to death simply because a man claimed she had bewitched him into loving her, or because someone in the community believed she had used magic to steal another woman's husband. The story of Agnes Waterhouse, one of the first women executed for witchcraft in England in 1566, illustrates how romantic relationships could become entangled with accusations of supernatural crime. Agnes was an elderly widow who lived alone and was known for her knowledge of herbal remedies. When several young men in her village experienced unrequited love or romantic disappointments, rumors began to spread that Agnes was using magic to interfere with their romantic lives. The accusations escalated until she was arrested, tried, and executed for witchcraft, despite the complete lack of credible evidence against her. The fear of supernatural influence extended to every aspect of courtship and marriage. Wedding ceremonies included numerous rituals and protections designed to ward off evil spirits and malicious magic. Brides wore specific colors, carried particular herbs, or performed certain actions to protect themselves from supernatural interference. The wedding night itself was surrounded by superstitions and protective rituals, as it was believed to be a particularly vulnerable time when evil forces might try to curse the union or prevent consummation. Even the simple act of gift-giving between lovers was fraught with supernatural implications. A ring, a lock of hair, or a pressed flower could be interpreted as a magical charm or a component in a love spell. Young people had to be extremely careful about what they gave to or received from romantic interests, as innocent tokens of affection could later be used as evidence of witchcraft if the relationship went sour or if someone wanted to make accusations. The belief in the evil eye added another layer of danger to romantic relationships. It was widely believed that certain individuals could curse others simply by looking at them with malicious intent. This meant that jealous rivals, disappointed suitors, or disapproving family members could be blamed for romantic misfortunes through supernatural means. If a couple experienced problems in their relationship, if a pregnancy ended in miscarriage, or if one partner fell ill, it might be attributed to the evil eye rather than natural causes. The concept of demonic possession also impacted romantic relationships in terrifying ways. Young women who displayed unusual behavior, particularly if it involved rejecting arranged marriages or expressing strong romantic preferences, might be accused of being possessed by demons. The treatments for such possession were brutal and often fatal, involving exorcisms, beatings, starvation, and other forms of torture designed to drive out the supposed evil spirits. Religious authorities actively promoted these supernatural fears as a way of controlling romantic and sexual behavior. By teaching people to be suspicious of their own emotions and to fear supernatural influence in their relationships, the church maintained strict control over courtship and marriage practices. Young people were discouraged from following their hearts or making independent romantic choices, as such actions might be evidence of supernatural manipulation. The intersection of medicine and magic created additional dangers for those seeking help with romantic problems. Herbalists, midwives, and folk healers who provided remedies for lovesickness, infertility, or other romantic difficulties were particularly vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft. Even physicians and learned men could find themselves accused of using supernatural means if their treatments were too successful or if they were associated with romantic scandals. The psychological impact of living under such superstitious terror cannot be overstated. Young people grew up believing that their most natural and fundamental emotions were potentially dangerous, that expressions of love might be evidence of supernatural corruption, and that romantic relationships were constantly threatened by invisible malevolent forces. This created a culture of fear and suspicion that made genuine intimacy and trust nearly impossible to achieve. The documentation from medieval and early modern court records reveals the devastating human cost of these supernatural beliefs. Countless women were tortured and executed on charges related to love magic or romantic witchcraft. Families were torn apart by accusations and suspicions. Communities were divided by fear and paranoia. The very bonds that should have brought people together became sources of danger and terror. The irony is that many of the practices condemned as supernatural were actually based on genuine knowledge of herbs, psychology, and human behavior. Women who understood how to use certain plants to improve health, who could read people's emotions and provide good advice, or who simply had the confidence to live independently, were often the ones accused of witchcraft. The systematic persecution of such women represented not just an attack on individuals, but a broader assault on female knowledge and autonomy. The belief in supernatural influence also served as a convenient excuse for men who wanted to escape responsibility for their romantic choices. A man who abandoned his wife for another woman could claim he had been bewitched. A nobleman who broke an engagement could argue that he had been under supernatural influence. These accusations allowed men to avoid the social and legal consequences of their actions, while simultaneously destroying the lives of the women they blamed. The fear of love magic extended even to the highest levels of society. Royal marriages were surrounded by elaborate protective rituals, and court physicians were constantly on guard against supernatural threats to royal romantic relationships. Kings and queens employed specialists in counter magic to protect against romantic curses, and political enemies might be accused of using supernatural means to interfere with royal marriages or fertility. The artistic and literary culture of the medieval period both reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Stories of enchantresses, love potions, and magical seduction were extremely popular, but they also served to reinforce the idea that romantic relationships were inherently dangerous and potentially supernatural in nature. Young people absorbed these cultural messages, learning to view their own romantic experiences through a lens of suspicion and fear. The legal codes of medieval Europe reveal how thoroughly supernatural beliefs had penetrated the justice system. Laws against love magic were detailed and severe, with punishments ranging from fines and public humiliation to torture and execution. The fact that such laws existed and were regularly enforced demonstrates how seriously these supernatural threats were taken by medieval authorities. The economic impact of supernatural fears around romance was also significant. Families might spend considerable resources on protective charms, counter spells, and other supernatural defenses for their children's romantic relationships. The fear of magical interference could disrupt trade relationships, political alliances, and social connections, as people became suspicious of anyone who might have supernatural motivations for their romantic advice or interference. The geographic spread of these beliefs was remarkable, extending across all of Europe and beyond. While specific practices and beliefs varied from region to region, the underlying fear of supernatural influence in romantic relationships was virtually universal. This suggests that these beliefs served important social and psychological functions, even as they caused tremendous suffering and injustice. As we reflect on this dark chapter in the history of human relationships, we see how the combination of ignorance, fear, and social control created a perfect storm of terror around the most basic human emotions. The medieval period's supernatural beliefs about love and romance represent perhaps the most extreme example in human history of how society can turn the natural desire for connection and intimacy into a source of mortal danger. The legacy of these beliefs extended far beyond the medieval period, influencing attitudes toward women, sexuality, and romantic relationships for centuries to come. The witch trials of the early modern period, the persecution of women healers and midwives, and the broader cultural suspicion of female independence all had their roots in the medieval period's supernatural fears around romance and sexuality. In examining this aspect of medieval romantic life, we gain insight not just into the past, but into the ongoing human tendency to fear and demonize what we don't understand. The medieval period's supernatural beliefs about love remind us of how dangerous it can be when ignorance and fear are allowed to override reason and compassion, and how the most beautiful aspects of human experience can be twisted into sources of terror and persecution. The young woman Isabel, with whom we began this exploration, might have lived her entire life in fear that her innocent attempts to attract love would be misinterpreted as witchcraft. In a world where even the most natural human desires were viewed with supernatural suspicion, the simple act of falling in love became not just a personal risk, but a potential death sentence. This represents perhaps the cruelest irony of medieval romantic life, that the very emotions that make us most human were treated as evidence of inhuman corruption. Here's part 7 of the Why Dating Was a Nightmare in Medieval Times script. But perhaps the cruelest twist of fate for medieval lovers was how death itself seemed to lurk around every romantic corner. In an age where life expectancy barely reached 30 for the common folk, finding love was often a race against time itself. Young women who managed to catch the eye of a suitor faced the terrifying prospect of childbirth, which killed more mothers than any battlefield claimed soldiers. The crude understanding of anatomy and complete absence of sterile birthing practices meant that bringing forth the fruit of love often became a death sentence. Consider the tragic tale of Marguerite de Montclair, a noblewoman whose story was recorded in the chronicles of 13th century France. At 17, she was considered ancient by medieval standards for marriage, having somehow avoided the typical arrangement that would have seen her wed at 14. When she finally fell genuinely in love with a young knight named Guillaume, their romance seemed blessed by fortune. They exchanged secret letters written in the flowery language of courtly love, met in hidden alcoves of her father's castle, and dreamed of a life together that transcended the usual political machinations of noble marriage. But their love story, like so many others, was destined for heartbreak. When Marguerite became pregnant with their child, what should have been a moment of joy became a countdown to catastrophe. Medieval childbirth was a barbaric affair conducted by midwives whose knowledge came more from superstition than science. They believed that a difficult labour could be eased by hanging eagle stones around the mother's neck, or that placing a knife under the birthing bed would cut the pain. When complications arose, as they inevitably did, their solutions were often worse than the problems they tried to solve. Marguerite laboured for 3 agonising days, while Guillaume paced frantically outside her chamber door. The midwives burned aromatic herbs and chanted prayers, but they were powerless against the medical emergency unfolding before them. When she finally succumbed to what we now know was likely sepsis or hemorrhaging, Guillaume was left not only heartbroken, but also blamed by her family for her death. In their grief and rage, they accused him of bewitching their daughter, of leading her astray with unholy desires that God had punished with death. This wasn't an isolated tragedy, but rather the grim reality for countless medieval couples. Even if lovers managed to navigate the treacherous waters of social expectations, religious restrictions, and family politics, they still had to contend with the simple biological fact that love in the Middle Ages was often cut short by death. Infectious diseases swept through communities with terrifying regularity, claiming young and old alike. The Black Death alone killed an estimated 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, leaving behind countless widows and widowers who had barely begun their lives together. The constant presence of death created a peculiar intensity to medieval romance. Lovers couldn't afford the luxury of long courtships or gradual emotional development. When life could end at any moment from plague, injury, or childbirth, every stolen kiss carried the weight of potential finality. This urgency infused medieval love poetry with a desperate quality that modern readers often find both beautiful and heartbreaking. The famous troubadour songs of unrequited love weren't just artistic conceits, but reflections of a world where love was frequently interrupted by the grave. But death wasn't the only spectre haunting medieval romance. The very act of falling in love was considered dangerous to one's spiritual well-being. The medieval church taught that passionate love was a form of spiritual sickness that could lead the soul astray from its proper devotion to God. This created an impossible paradox for young people whose hearts naturally yearned for connection and intimacy. They were told that the very feelings that made them most human were also the feelings most likely to damn them for eternity. The concept of romantic love as a positive force was so foreign to medieval thinking that when it began to emerge in the 12th century through the literature of courtly love, it was revolutionary and dangerous. The idea that a man might worship a woman with the same fervour typically reserved for the Virgin Mary was scandalous. The notion that sexual desire could be ennobling rather than degrading challenged the fundamental assumptions of medieval Christianity. Yet even this supposedly elevated form of love was fraught with peril, as it was typically adulterous in nature, celebrated the suffering of unfulfilled desire, and often ended in tragedy. The troubadour tradition that gave birth to our modern conception of romantic love was built on the foundation of impossible relationships. The knight who loved his lord's wife, the lady who pined for a man she could never marry, the young lovers separated by class or circumstance. These weren't seen as problems to be solved, but as the very essence of pure love. The idea was that love became more perfect the more it was denied physical fulfillment, creating a culture that simultaneously celebrated and tortured young hearts. Medieval medical theory added another layer of danger to the act of falling in love. Physicians believed that intense emotion could literally make a person sick, and lovesickness was considered a genuine medical condition with potentially fatal consequences. The symptoms included loss of appetite, insomnia, fever, and what we might now recognize as severe depression. The prescribed treatments were often as dangerous as the condition itself, involving bloodletting, purging, and the administration of powerful herbs that could poison as easily as heal. The story of Abelard and Heloise, perhaps the most famous lovers of the medieval period, illustrates how intellectual and emotional connection could be just as dangerous as physical passion. Their love affair began as a tutorial relationship when the brilliant philosopher Abelard was hired to tutor the equally brilliant Heloise. Their intellectual connection blossomed into romantic love, which led to a secret marriage and a child. But when Heloise's uncle discovered their relationship, he had Abelard brutally castrated as punishment. The lovers were forced apart, with Heloise entering a convent and Abelard becoming a monk, spending the rest of their lives exchanging heart-wrenching letters that spoke of a love that could never be fully realized. Their story became legendary not because it ended happily, but because it didn't. Medieval audiences understood that true love was supposed to end in suffering. The idea that lovers might live happily ever after was not just unrealistic, but somehow cheapened the very concept of love. This cultural expectation meant that young people entering into romantic relationships did so with the understanding that heartbreak was not just possible, but probable. The violence that surrounded medieval romance wasn't limited to the dramatic gestures of jealous husbands or protective families. Even consensual relationships were conducted within a framework of physical danger that is difficult for modern people to comprehend. The simple act of meeting secretly could result in accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or heresy, any of which could lead to torture and execution. Young women who showed too much independence in matters of the heart risked being labelled as wanton or possessed, while young men could find themselves accused of seduction, rape, or corruption of innocence. The legal system offered little protection for lovers who found themselves on the wrong side of social expectations. Women had virtually no legal rights when it came to matters of marriage and sexuality. They could be married off against their will, divorced without cause, or accused of adultery on the flimsiest of evidence. Men faced different but equally serious dangers, particularly if they dared to love above their social station or to interfere with the marital plans of powerful families. Even the physical spaces where medieval people lived conspired against romantic privacy. Most people lived in one-room houses shared with extended family and livestock. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford, and intimate conversations had to be conducted under the watchful eyes of parents, siblings, and neighbours. The romantic ideal of stolen moments and secret meetings was born partly from necessity, as there were few other options for couples who wanted to express their feelings away from the prying eyes of society. The economic realities of medieval life added yet another layer of complexity to romantic relationships. Love might bloom between two hearts, but marriage was fundamentally an economic transaction that involved the transfer of property, the formation of political alliances, and the continuation of family lines. Even among the peasantry, where romantic considerations might theoretically have more weight, practical concerns about combining resources and establishing viable households often trumped matters of the heart. This economic framework meant that falling in love with the wrong person wasn't just emotionally devastating, but could be financially ruinous for entire families. A young woman who refused an advantageous marriage in favor of a love match might find herself disinherited and cast out, with no means of supporting herself. A young man who pursued a woman above his station might face not only rejection, but also economic retaliation from her family and their allies. The seasonal rhythms of medieval life also imposed constraints on romance that are difficult for modern people to understand. Agricultural societies lived according to the demands of planting and harvest, with little time for leisure or courtship during the busiest periods of the year. Young people might meet during religious festivals or market days, but these brief encounters had to sustain relationships through long periods of separation and hard work. The harsh realities of medieval hygiene and medical care meant that even the most passionate lovers had to contend with physical conditions that would challenge any romantic relationship. Without effective treatments for dental problems, skin diseases, or infectious conditions, physical attraction was often fleeting. The romantic ideal of beauty was constantly undermined by the practical realities of bodies that aged quickly and suffered from conditions that modern medicine treats routinely. Yet despite all these obstacles and dangers, love persisted in the medieval world with a tenacity that speaks to the fundamental human need for connection and intimacy. The very fact that romantic literature flourished during this period, that love songs were composed and sung despite the risks, that young people continued to fall in love despite the odds stacked against them, testifies to the power of human emotion to transcend even the most oppressive circumstances. The medieval lovers who dared to follow their hearts in the face of such overwhelming opposition were perhaps braver than any knight who ever rode into battle, for they fought against not just individual enemies, but against the entire structure of their society and the very conception of what it meant to be human in their time. Looking at your script summary and the reference materials, I'll continue from where Part 7 left off, focusing on the supernatural beliefs and witchcraft fears that plagued medieval romantic relationships. Here's Part 8. But perhaps no aspect of medieval romance was more terrifying than the pervasive belief that love itself could be the work of dark magic. In a world where the supernatural lurked behind every shadow, where devils whispered temptations, and witches brewed potions in moonlit forests. The very act of falling in love was viewed with deep suspicion and fear. The medieval mind saw enchantment everywhere, especially in matters of the heart. When a nobleman suddenly became infatuated with a serving girl, or when a merchant's wife abandoned her family for a wandering minstrel, the explanation was clear to all who witnessed it. Witchcraft was at work. Love potions, enchanted amulets, and demonic pacts were believed to be the true causes of romantic passion, not the natural stirrings of the human heart. Women bore the brunt of these accusations. Any woman who possessed unusual beauty, healing knowledge, or simply the misfortune to inspire intense desire was at risk of being branded a witch. The very qualities that made someone attractive, intelligence, independence, a way with herbs or animals, were precisely the traits that medieval society associated with supernatural malevolence. Consider the tragic tale of Marguerite de Porret, a French mystic and author who lived in the late 13th century. Marguerite wrote passionate spiritual texts about divine love, describing her soul's union with God in language so fervent and sensual that it scandalized the church authorities. Her crime was not heresy in the traditional sense, but rather the dangerous act of a woman speaking openly about love, even divine love, with too much knowledge and too much passion. The Inquisition declared her a heretic, demanding she recant her writings and submit to male religious authority. When Marguerite refused to be silenced, refusing to acknowledge that her understanding of divine love was somehow corrupted or demonic, she was burned at the stake in Paris in 1310. Her books were ordered destroyed, though copies survived in secret, passed down by those who recognized the genuine spirituality in her words, rather than the supposed witchcraft her persecutors claimed to see. But Marguerite's fate was far from unique. Across medieval Europe, women who dared to speak of love, to practice healing arts, or to live independently faced similar accusations. The very act of inspiring desire in men was often seen as evidence of supernatural manipulation. If a married man abandoned his wife for another woman, the blame fell not on the man's choices, but on the supposed sorceress who had ensnared him with her dark arts. The fear of love magic permeated every level of society. Noble families hired priests to bless their marriages and ward off enchantments. Merchants carried protective charms to guard against the seductive spells of foreign women in distant ports. Even peasants whispered prayers over their children's cradles, begging God to protect them from the evil eye of jealous neighbors who might curse them to lives of loneliness or destructive passion. This paranoia created a culture where genuine affection was constantly questioned and analyzed for signs of supernatural influence. Was a sudden attraction natural, or the result of a love filter slipped into wine? Did a woman's beauty come from God, or from a pact with Satan? These questions tormented medieval minds, turning what should have been joyful experiences into sources of terror and suspicion. The church actively encouraged these fears, teaching that excessive passion was inherently sinful and likely demonic in origin. Priests warned their congregations that Satan used beautiful women as his primary weapons against righteous men, that lust was the devil's favorite tool for claiming souls. Love that burned too brightly, that defied social conventions or family arrangements, was automatically suspect. Medical texts of the era, influenced by both classical learning and Christian theology, described romantic love as a form of madness, a disease that clouded judgment and led to spiritual ruin. Physicians prescribed bloodletting, fasting, and prayer to cure those afflicted with what they termed amor hereos, the sickness of excessive love. The symptoms they described, sleeplessness, loss of appetite, obsessive thoughts, were indeed real, but their understanding of the cause was filtered through a worldview that saw demonic influence in every strong emotion. This medicalization of love served to further stigmatize romantic passion, particularly for women. A woman who displayed too much desire, who seemed to enjoy physical intimacy or who actively pursued a romantic relationship was likely to be diagnosed as either possessed by demons or practicing witchcraft herself. The cure often involved exorcism, public penance, or in extreme cases, accusations of heresy that could lead to execution. The fear of love magic also created a thriving underground economy of supposed protection and counterspells. Wise women, despite the risks they faced, sold charms and potions to ward off unwanted romantic attention or to break perceived enchantments. Priests offered special masses and blessings for those who believed themselves bewitched by love. Ironically, the very people society turned to for protection from love magic were often the same individuals who would later be accused of practicing it. Young people growing up in this atmosphere learned to fear their own emotions. Natural sexual development was viewed through the lens of spiritual warfare, with parents and religious authorities constantly watching for signs that their children had fallen under malevolent influence. The awakening of romantic feelings, instead of being celebrated as a natural part of human development, became a source of shame and terror. The legal system reflected and reinforced these supernatural fears. Courts regularly heard cases involving accusations of love magic, with testimony often consisting of nothing more than the claim that someone had fallen in love inappropriately. The burden of proof was impossibly low. If a man abandoned his family for another woman, if a young person defied their parents' choice of spouse, if someone displayed what was considered excessive passion, these behaviors alone could serve as evidence of witchcraft. The punishments for convicted love witches were severe and designed to serve as public warnings. Women found guilty of using magic to inspire love were subjected to public humiliation, physical torture, and often death. Their supposed victims, usually men who'd been bewitched into infidelity or inappropriate desire, were typically absolved of responsibility, treated as innocent parties who had been overcome by forces beyond their control. This system created a perfect mechanism for men to escape accountability for their romantic choices, while simultaneously providing society with scapegoats for the disruptions that passionate love inevitably caused to carefully ordered social arrangements. A nobleman could abandon his arranged marriage for a more attractive partner and claim he had been bewitched, allowing him to pursue his desires while maintaining his social standing and avoiding responsibility for breaking his vows. The impact on women's lives was devastating. Those who were beautiful, intelligent, or independent lived under constant threat of accusation. Many learned to deliberately make themselves less attractive, to hide their knowledge, to suppress their personalities in hopes of avoiding suspicion. Others retreated into religious life, seeking protection within convent walls, where their rejection of romantic love could be seen as holy rather than suspicious. But perhaps most tragically, these beliefs poisoned the very experience of love itself. In a world where passionate affection was viewed as evidence of demonic influence, where strong attraction was seen as proof of supernatural manipulation, genuine romantic connection became nearly impossible. Couples who might have found joy and fulfillment in each other's company instead lived in constant fear that their feelings were either sinful or artificial, the product of dark magic rather than natural human emotion. The psychological damage was immense. People learned to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potentially evil or false. The spontaneous joy of new love, the comfort of long partnership, the excitement of mutual attraction, all were tainted by the constant worry that these feelings might be the devil's work. Love, which should have been a source of happiness and connection, became instead a minefield of spiritual danger and social suspicion. Even successful relationships were shadowed by these fears. Couples who genuinely cared for each other had to constantly prove that their affection was natural and godly, rather than the result of enchantment. They were expected to demonstrate appropriate restraint, to show that their love served God and society rather than selfish passion. The simple act of enjoying one's spouse too much could raise suspicions about the supernatural nature of the relationship. This created a culture where emotional authenticity was not just discouraged, but actively dangerous. People learned to perform the approved forms of affection while hiding their true feelings, leading to relationships built on fear and pretense rather than genuine connection. The very foundation of romantic love, the honest expression of attraction and care, was undermined by the constant threat of supernatural accusation. The children who grew up in such an environment inherited these fears and suspicions, perpetuating a cycle where each generation learned to view love through the lens of spiritual warfare. Young people received their first lessons about romance not through gentle guidance about healthy relationships, but through warnings about the demonic dangers of passion and the need to constantly guard against supernatural seduction. As we delve deeper into the medieval approach to courtship and marriage, we see how these supernatural fears shaped every aspect of romantic life, creating systems of surveillance and control that made genuine love not just difficult, but genuinely dangerous. The next phase of our exploration will reveal how these beliefs translated into the practical realities of medieval courtship, where young people attempting to find love faced not only social obstacles, but the very real threat of accusation, persecution, and death. In this world where love itself was suspect, where passion was proof of corruption, and where women who inspired desire faced accusations of witchcraft, the simple human need for connection and affection became a perilous journey through supernatural terrors and social condemnation. It was a system that served power and control far better than it served the human heart, creating a medieval romance that was indeed a nightmare of fear, suspicion, and tragic loss. Part 9. The superstitious terror of medieval romance. The suffocating grip of superstition cast an even darker shadow over medieval romance than the physical and social constraints we've already explored. In a world where the line between the natural and supernatural remained dangerously thin, love itself became suspect, viewed through a lens of fear that transformed tender feelings into potential evidence of demonic interference or witchcraft. Medieval society lived in perpetual terror of unseen forces. Every unexplained event, every sudden illness, every stroke of misfortune could be attributed to malevolent supernatural intervention. And nowhere was this paranoia more destructive than in matters of the heart. Love, with its mysterious power to transform behavior and inspire seemingly irrational actions, appeared to medieval minds as a force that could only be explained through supernatural means. Consider the plight of Eleanor, a young merchant's daughter in 14th century France. When she began displaying the telltale signs of romantic infatuation, gazing dreamily into the distance, losing her appetite, and speaking in passionate whispers about the blacksmith's apprentice, her family didn't see the natural bloom of young love. Instead, they saw the unmistakable symptoms of demonic possession or enchantment. Eleanor's father immediately called for the local priest, convinced that his daughter had fallen under a malevolent spell. This wasn't an isolated incident of paranoid overreaction. Medieval medical texts actually described love as a form of mental illness called lovesickness or erotic melancholy, symptoms of which supposedly included the very behaviors we now recognize as normal romantic attraction. The influential physician Constantine the African wrote extensively about love as a dangerous disease that could drive sufferers to madness, violence, or death. When someone exhibited signs of romantic passion, medieval society often responded not with understanding or support, but with fear and attempts at supernatural intervention. The church played a particularly sinister role in fostering these superstitious terrors. Religious authorities routinely preached that romantic love represented a dangerous departure from proper Christian devotion. They warned that passionate feelings could open the soul to demonic influence, making lovers vulnerable to Satan's temptations. Young people were taught to be suspicious of their own emotions, to view romantic desire as potentially sinful or even diabolical. This religious paranoia created a climate where expressing romantic feelings became an act of considerable courage. A young man composing love poetry risked being accused of practicing dark arts. A woman who showed too much enthusiasm for a suitor might find herself suspected of witchcraft. The very intensity that makes love beautiful became, in medieval minds, evidence of supernatural corruption. The fear of love magic pervaded every level of society. Wealthy nobles employed food tasters not just to guard against poison, but to detect love potions that might compromise their judgment in marriage negotiations. Merchants kept careful watch over their daughters, worried that rivals might use supernatural means to manipulate romantic attachments for business advantage. Even peasants lived in terror that their romantic rivals might employ cunning women or wise men to cast spells that would steal away their beloved's affections. These fears weren't entirely baseless within the medieval worldview. A thriving underground economy existed around love magic, with cunning folk, hedge witches, and folk healers offering potions, charms, and spells designed to kindle, enhance, or destroy romantic feelings. While these practitioners were often simply herbalists using natural aphrodisiacs or psychological manipulation, medieval society saw them as wielding genuinely supernatural powers. The consequences of this superstitious terror were devastating for ordinary people trying to navigate romance. Young lovers found themselves caught between their natural feelings and a society that viewed those feelings as potentially demonic. They had to hide their emotions, suppress their passions, and constantly worry that their love might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. Margaret of Wessex, a 15th century wool merchant's daughter, left behind a diary that provides haunting insight into this psychological torment. She wrote of her love for a young clerk named Thomas, but her entries are filled with self-doubt and terror. She constantly questioned whether her feelings were natural or the result of some malevolent spell. She prayed daily for God to cleanse her heart of what she feared might be demonic influence. When Thomas began returning her affections, she became convinced that she had somehow corrupted him through supernatural means. This internalized fear created a vicious cycle. The more intensely someone experienced love, the more convinced they became that supernatural forces were at work. This led to guilt, self-loathing, and attempts to suppress or deny romantic feelings. Young people were taught to distrust their own hearts, to view their deepest emotions as potential evidence of spiritual corruption. The superstitious terror surrounding love also provided convenient weapons for those seeking to destroy romantic relationships. Jealous rivals could destroy a courtship simply by spreading rumors of love magic. Parents opposed to a match could claim their child had been enchanted. Spurned lovers could seek revenge by accusing their former beloved of practicing witchcraft. These accusations carried terrifying consequences. Suspected practitioners of love magic faced trials that often involved torture designed to extract confessions. The procedures for detecting love magic were barbaric and often fatal. Accused women might be subjected to swimming tests, where they were bound and thrown into water on the theory that witches would float while innocent women would sink. They faced pricking tests, where investigators searched their bodies for supernatural marks that supposedly proved their guilt. Even when formal accusations weren't made, the fear of love magic created an atmosphere of constant suspicion and paranoia. Couples had to be extraordinarily careful about how they expressed their feelings, worried that too much passion might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural manipulation. They lived in fear that rejected suitors or jealous rivals might spread rumors that would destroy not just their relationship, but their reputations and possibly their lives. The documentation from medieval witch trials reveals the devastating impact of these superstitious terrors on romantic relationships. In case after case, we see love affairs destroyed by accusations of magic. Young women were burned at the stake for the crime of being too attractive, too charming, or too successful in matters of the heart. Men found themselves accused of using supernatural means to seduce women above their social station. The trial records of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in 1566 for witchcraft, illustrate this pattern perfectly. Agnes was accused of using magic to make various men fall in love with her, to break up established relationships, and to cause impotence in men who rejected her advances. The evidence against her consisted primarily of testimony that she was unusually successful in romantic matters, and that several men had developed strong feelings for her. In a society where female romantic agency was viewed with suspicion, Agnes's apparent ability to attract and influence men was interpreted as proof of supernatural powers. This case demonstrates how the superstitious terror surrounding love particularly targeted women. In medieval thinking, women were seen as more susceptible to demonic influence and more likely to use supernatural means to achieve their goals. A woman who was too beautiful, too charming, or too successful in love automatically became suspect. Female romantic agency was so threatening to medieval patriarchal structures that it was literally demonized. The fear of love magic also created terrible situations for women who were naturally attractive or charismatic. Beauty itself became suspect, viewed as potentially supernatural in origin. Women learned to downplay their appearance and suppress their natural charm, worried that too much success in romantic matters might lead to accusations of witchcraft. This superstitious terror extended beyond individual relationships to poison entire communities. Villages lived in constant fear that cunning women among them might be practicing love magic. Neighbors watched each other suspiciously, looking for signs of supernatural romantic manipulation. The slightest unusual romantic development, a sudden infatuation, an unexpected marriage, a broken engagement, could trigger investigations and accusations. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat cannot be overstated. Young people grew up learning to distrust their own emotions, to view romantic love as potentially dangerous and possibly demonic. They internalized fears that made genuine intimacy nearly impossible. How could someone fully open their heart when they'd been taught that romantic passion might be evidence of supernatural corruption? These superstitious terrors also created terrible dilemmas for people experiencing genuine love. They had to choose between following their hearts and protecting themselves from accusations of magic. Many chose safety over love, suppressing their feelings and entering into loveless but socially acceptable marriages. Others risked everything for love, knowing that their passion might be interpreted as evidence of demonic influence. The documentation of medieval love magic trials reveals the creative cruelty of a society determined to control and suppress romantic feelings. Accused practitioners faced interrogations designed to extract confessions of supernatural activities. They were asked to explain how they had learned their magical arts, to name their demonic allies, and to confess to specific acts of romantic manipulation. The torture methods used in these investigations were particularly horrific because they were designed to extract confessions that would justify the accuser's superstitious beliefs. Women were subjected to sleep deprivation, physical torture, and psychological manipulation until they would confess to anything. The resulting testimonies, extracted under extreme duress, were then used as evidence that love magic was real and widespread. These forced confessions created a self-perpetuating cycle of terror. Each tortured confession provided evidence that supported society's superstitious beliefs about love magic. This evidence was then used to justify more investigations, more tortures, and more executions. The documentation from these trials was circulated widely, spreading paranoia and providing templates for future accusations. The superstitious terror surrounding medieval romance reached its peak during the great witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries. During this period, thousands of people, mostly women, were executed for practicing magic, and a significant proportion of these cases involved accusations of love magic. The famous Malleus Maleficarum, the handbook for witch hunters published in 1487, devoted extensive sections to detecting and prosecuting love magic. This systematic persecution created a climate where romantic love became literally life-threatening. Young people learned that expressing passion too openly or successfully attracting romantic partners could lead to accusations of witchcraft. They lived in constant fear that their natural emotions might be interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption. The economic dimension of these superstitious terrors added another layer of horror to medieval romance. Accusations of love magic became tools for economic warfare. Successful merchants might find their daughters accused of using supernatural charms to attract wealthy suitors. Prosperous widows who remarried could face claims that they had enchanted their new husbands. Even peasant women who managed to marry above their station risked accusations that they had used magic to seduce their husbands. These economic motivations meant that accusations of love magic often targeted the most vulnerable members of society. Poor women who had somehow achieved romantic success found themselves particularly suspect. Their inability to afford legal representation or social protection made them easy targets for accusations that could result in property confiscation, exile, or death. The intersection of superstitious terror with medieval romance also reveals the deep-seated fear of female sexuality that permeated medieval society. Women who displayed sexual agency or romantic initiative were automatically suspect. They were seen as potentially using supernatural means to overcome the natural male dominance that medieval society considered proper. This fear of female romantic agency led to the development of elaborate tests and procedures designed to detect supernatural influence in romantic relationships. Church authorities developed questionnaires to determine whether romantic feelings were natural or magically induced. They looked for signs like sudden onset of passion, intensity of feeling, or romantic success that exceeded what they considered natural for a person's social status or physical attractiveness. The documentation from medieval communities reveals how these superstitious terrors poisoned relationships between neighbors, friends, and family members. People learned to be suspicious of each other's romantic successes. They watched for signs that others might be using supernatural means to achieve romantic goals. Community gatherings became opportunities for surveillance and suspicion, rather than celebration and connection. The psychological warfare inherent in these superstitious systems was particularly cruel. Accused individuals faced not just legal consequences, but complete social isolation. Their friends and family members, terrified of being associated with suspected practitioners of magic, would abandon them. Even those who escaped formal prosecution often found their lives destroyed by suspicion and social ostracism. The religious dimensions of medieval superstitious terror created additional layers of psychological torment for people experiencing romantic love. They were taught that their feelings might be sinful, that romantic passion could damn their souls, and that they needed to constantly examine their emotions for signs of demonic influence. This created a form of spiritual torture where people learned to distrust and fear their own hearts. The medical establishment of medieval Europe contributed to these superstitious terrors by providing seemingly scientific explanations for the supernatural nature of romantic love. Physicians wrote extensively about love as a form of madness caused by supernatural influences. They developed elaborate theories about how demons could manipulate human emotions and prescribed treatments that often involved exorcism or other religious interventions. These medical theories gave scholarly legitimacy to popular superstitions about love magic. When learned physicians confirmed that romantic passion could be caused by supernatural influences, it became much easier for ordinary people to believe that their neighbors might be practicing love magic. The fusion of medical authority with superstitious belief created a particularly powerful and destructive form of paranoia. The legal systems of medieval Europe developed elaborate procedures for prosecuting love magic, creating bureaucratic machinery for destroying romantic relationships. Courts developed standardized methods for investigating accusations, interrogating suspects, and determining guilt or innocence. These procedures gave the appearance of legal legitimacy to what were essentially exercises in superstitious persecution. The documentation from these legal proceedings reveals the systematic nature of the terror surrounding medieval romance. Accusations followed predictable patterns, investigations used standard techniques, and punishments were carefully calibrated to create maximum deterrent effect. This wasn't random persecution, but organized campaign to control and suppress romantic feelings through fear. The international nature of these superstitious terrors meant that people couldn't escape them by moving to different regions or countries. The fear of love magic spread across medieval Europe, creating a continental climate of romantic paranoia. Trade routes and pilgrimage paths carried not just goods and people, but also superstitious beliefs and persecution techniques. This widespread nature of romantic superstition meant that medieval people lived under a constant cloud of fear that could follow them anywhere. A young couple might flee their home village to escape accusations of love magic, only to find the same suspicions and dangers in their new community. There was literally nowhere in medieval Europe where romantic love was entirely safe from superstitious persecution. As we examine the devastating impact of superstitious terror on medieval romance, we see how fear and paranoia poisoned what should have been humanity's most beautiful and natural experiences. Love, which should bring joy and connection, became a source of terror and danger. Young people learned to suppress their deepest emotions and distrust their own hearts. Communities turned against their own members based on nothing more than successful romantic relationships. The legacy of these medieval superstitious terrors extended far beyond the Middle Ages, creating cultural patterns of sexual shame and romantic fear that persisted for centuries. The idea that passionate love might be supernatural or dangerous, that female romantic agency was inherently suspect, that successful relationships required explanation beyond natural attraction. These beliefs shaped European culture for generations. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not just how far we've come in accepting romantic love as natural and beautiful, but also how deeply embedded these superstitious fears became in Western culture. The medieval terror of love magic may seem distant and foreign to us now, but its echoes can still be found in modern anxieties about sexuality, romance, and emotional expression. The brave individuals who risked everything for love during these dark centuries, who chose to follow their hearts despite the supernatural terrors surrounding them, represent some of humanity's greatest heroes. They fought not just against social constraints and physical dangers, but against a culture that had literally demonized their deepest emotions. Their courage in the face of such overwhelming fear and persecution stands as a testament to the indomitable power of human love to survive even the darkest and most superstitious of times. Looking at your summary and the reference materials, here's part 10 of the script, continuing from where you left off. As we've seen throughout this exploration of medieval romance, the very foundations of love and courtship were built upon a bedrock of suffering, superstition, and social control. But perhaps no aspect of medieval life demonstrates the true nightmare of dating more starkly than the complete absence of personal agency that defined romantic relationships for the vast majority of people. In our modern world, we take for granted the fundamental right to choose our own partners, to date freely, to marry for love rather than obligation. But in medieval times, such freedoms were not merely rare, they were actively dangerous. Consider the life of a typical peasant girl named Margaret, living in the 14th century England. At the age of 12, Margaret's fate was already sealed. Her father, a struggling serf bound to his lord's estate, had negotiated her betrothal to Thomas, the son of a neighbouring farmer. The arrangement had nothing to do with Margaret's wishes or feelings. She had never even spoken to Thomas beyond a few awkward encounters at the village well. Instead, the match was purely transactional. Thomas's family owned a slightly larger plot of land and possessed 2 oxen rather than 1. The marriage would consolidate resources and provide Margaret's family with better access to ploughing equipment during the crucial planting season. Margaret herself was never consulted about this arrangement. The very idea that a young woman might have preferences about her future husband was not merely ignored, it was considered dangerous and potentially sinful. The church taught that feminine desires were inherently corrupting, that women who sought to choose their own partners were displaying the same prideful rebellion that had led Eve to doom mankind in the Garden of Eden. Margaret's role was to submit, to accept whatever husband her father deemed appropriate, and to consider herself fortunate that she was being provided for at all. But Margaret's story becomes even more tragic when we consider what this marriage actually meant for her daily existence. Thomas, her betrothed, was known throughout the village for his violent temper and his fondness for ale. He had already beaten his previous bride so severely that she had miscarried twice before finally dying in childbirth at the age of 16. The villagers whispered about Thomas's cruelty, but no one dared intervene. A husband's right to discipline his wife was not only legally protected, but religiously mandated. The church taught that just as Christ ruled over the church, so must a husband rule over his wife, with absolute authority and the right to use whatever force he deemed necessary to maintain order. Margaret's wedding day arrived when she turned 14, marked not by joy or celebration, but by a grim sense of inevitability. The ceremony itself was a brief perfunctory affair conducted in Latin that Margaret could not understand. She stood beside Thomas, her hands trembling not with excitement but with terror, as the priest intoned the words that would legally transfer ownership of her body and soul from her father to this virtual stranger. When the priest asked if she took Thomas as her husband, Margaret's whispered yes was barely audible. It was not consent in any meaningful sense. It was capitulation to a system that offered her no alternative. The wedding feast that followed was modest but revealing. Margaret sat silent and pale while the men of both families drank heavily and joked crudely about the consummation to come. Her new mother-in-law regaled the gathering with detailed advice about wifely submission, while her own mother wept quietly into her ale. No one asked Margaret how she felt about any of this. Her emotions were irrelevant. She was now property, to be used and disposed of as her husband saw fit. This complete absence of romantic agency extended far beyond the peasant class. Even among the nobility, where marriages were arranged to secure political alliances and consolidate power, the personal desires of the individuals involved were considered secondary at best. Princess Isabella of France was betrothed to the future King Edward II of England when she was only 6 years old. She would not meet her husband until their wedding day 12 years later, and by then, both of their fates were already sealed by treaties and political necessities far beyond their control. The marriage between Isabella and Edward proved to be a disaster on every conceivable level. Edward showed little interest in his wife, preferring the company of his male favourites who wielded enormous influence over the kingdom. Isabella found herself trapped in a loveless marriage to a weak and ineffectual king who seemed to care more about his companions than about ruling his realm or honouring his wife. But despite her royal status, Isabella had no legal recourse. She could not divorce Edward, could not leave him, could not even publicly criticise him without risking charges of treason. She was bound to him until death, regardless of how miserable that binding made her life. For both Margaret the peasant and Isabella the princess, the medieval concept of marriage was fundamentally about ownership and control rather than love or companionship. A wife was expected to surrender not only her body, but her very identity to her husband. She took his name, moved to his household, and became legally invisible in most matters. Her property became his property, her debts became his debts, and her children belonged to him absolutely. If she dared to resist this arrangement, if she showed any sign of independence or defiance, she could be beaten, imprisoned, or even killed with legal impunity. This system of romantic oppression was reinforced at every level of medieval society. The church preached that wifely submission was a sacred duty, that women who sought independence were following the path of Eve toward damnation. The legal system codified male dominance, making it virtually impossible for women to own property, enter contracts, or make decisions about their own lives. Even the medical establishment taught that women were fundamentally inferior creatures, possessed of wandering wombs that made them emotionally unstable and intellectually deficient. But perhaps most insidiously, this system was enforced through the constant threat of social ostracism and economic ruin. A woman who refused to marry, who left an abusive husband, or who dared to express romantic preferences that conflicted with her family's wishes, would find herself cast out from the only social networks that could provide her with protection and support. In a world where women had almost no legal rights and few economic opportunities, such isolation was often tantamount to a death sentence. The few women who did manage to resist this system paid an enormous price for their defiance. Take the case of Marjorie Kemper, a 14th century Englishwoman who experienced religious visions and felt called to a life of spiritual devotion. Despite being married with 14 children, Marjorie eventually convinced her husband to take a vow of chastity so that she could dedicate herself fully to her religious calling. But this decision made her a target of suspicion and harassment throughout her community. She was accused of heresy, threatened with burning at the stake, and constantly criticized for abandoning her proper role as a wife and mother. Even her own family sometimes turned against her, viewing her spiritual visions as evidence of madness or demonic possession. The story of medieval romance, then, is ultimately a story about the complete absence of choice, agency, and personal freedom in matters of the heart. It was a system designed not to promote love or happiness, but to maintain social order and consolidate power. Young people were treated as pawns in elaborate games of politics and economics, their personal desires and emotional needs considered irrelevant distractions from the serious business of securing alliances and transferring wealth. This systematic denial of romantic agency had profound psychological consequences for the people trapped within it. Chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of deep depression, suicidal despair, and violent outbursts among both men and women forced into unwanted marriages. Many people simply retreated into themselves, accepting their fate with a kind of numb resignation that allowed them to survive, but hardly to thrive. Others channeled their frustration into religious extremism, flagellant movements, or other forms of self-destructive behavior that at least gave them some sense of control over their own suffering. The medieval concept of courtly love, which we explored earlier, can be understood partly as a response to this crushing absence of romantic freedom. By celebrating impossible, unconsummated passion between knights and married ladies, courtly love provided a fantasy escape from the brutal realities of actual medieval marriage. It allowed people to imagine what love might feel like if it were based on choice, mutual attraction, and emotional connection rather than economic necessity and social obligation. But even this fantasy was tinged with tragedy and doom, reflecting the deep understanding that true romantic freedom was simply impossible within the constraints of medieval society. As we reach the end of our exploration into why dating was a nightmare in medieval times, we must confront the sobering reality that for most people living in that era, what we would recognize as dating simply did not exist. There was no period of courtship where young people could get to know each other, discover compatibility, or develop genuine affection. There were no opportunities for private conversation, shared activities, or the gradual building of emotional intimacy that we consider essential to healthy romantic relationships. Instead, there was only the grim machinery of social control, grinding forward with inexorable efficiency to sort people into predetermined roles and relationships that served the needs of the powerful while crushing the spirits of everyone else. Love, when it existed at all, was something that might develop after marriage if couples were extraordinarily fortunate. But it was never the foundation upon which relationships were built, and it was certainly never considered a sufficient reason to challenge the established order. In our modern world, for all its flaws and complications, we have at least established the principle that people should have the right to choose their own romantic partners, to marry for love rather than obligation, and to leave relationships that make them miserable. These freedoms, which we often take for granted, would have seemed like impossible dreams to our medieval ancestors. They represent centuries of struggle against systems of oppression and control that once seemed as permanent and unchangeable as the stones of the great cathedrals. When we complain about the difficulties of modern dating, the awkwardness of first meetings, the challenge of finding compatible partners, the pain of romantic rejection, we should remember Margaret, trembling at her wedding to a man she feared, and Isabella, trapped in a loveless marriage to a king who ignored her. We should remember all the countless individuals whose names history has forgotten, who lived and died without ever experiencing the simple joy of choosing to be with someone who truly cared for them. The nightmare of medieval dating was not just about the practical hardships we've explored throughout this series, the disease, the violence, the superstition, and the social constraints. It was about the fundamental denial of human dignity and agency in matters of the heart. It was about a world where love was considered dangerous, choice was forbidden, and happiness was sacrificed on the altar of social stability and political necessity. In understanding this dark chapter of human history, we can better appreciate not only how far we've come, but how precious and fragile our modern freedoms truly are. Based on the script summary and reference files, here's part 11 of the 12-part script for why dating was a nightmare in medieval times. As the shadows of the medieval world grew longer and the spectre of mortality loomed ever closer, love itself became perhaps the most dangerous gamble of all. For in this harsh realm where death could strike without warning, where accusations could destroy lives in an instant, and where the very act of survival consumed every waking hour, the pursuit of romantic connection was fraught with perils that would terrify even the bravest souls. Consider, if you will, the plight of young Margaret, a peasant girl of 17 summers, who had caught the eye of Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice. In our modern world, such a courtship might begin with casual conversation, perhaps a coffee date, maybe some innocent text messages. But in Margaret's world, even the simplest expression of mutual attraction could spiral into accusations of witchcraft, demonic possession, or moral corruption that could end with both lovers burning at the stake. The Church's iron grip on matters of the heart meant that love was not seen as a beautiful emotion to be celebrated, but as a dangerous weakness that could lead souls astray. Priests warned from their pulpits that romantic passion was nothing more than the devil's snare, designed to corrupt the faithful and drag them down to eternal damnation. Young people were taught that physical desire was inherently sinful, that even thinking about someone in a romantic way could condemn their immortal souls. For women especially, the expression of any romantic feeling was walking a tightrope over an abyss of social destruction. If a young woman showed too much interest in a man, she might be labelled a temptress or seductress. If she seemed too knowledgeable about matters of love or attraction, Whispers would begin that she must be practicing love magic or consorting with supernatural forces. The line between normal human emotion and suspected witchcraft was so thin, it was practically invisible. And what of the physical realities of medieval romance? In a world without modern hygiene, without understanding of disease transmission, without even the most basic medical knowledge, intimate relationships were literally life-threatening endeavors. Sexually transmitted diseases ran rampant through medieval populations, often leading to painful, lingering deaths that were seen as divine punishment for moral transgression. Women faced the constant terror of pregnancy in an age when childbirth was essentially a coin flip between life and death. The very concept of consent, which we consider fundamental to healthy relationships today, barely existed in medieval legal or social frameworks. Women were considered property, first of their fathers, then of their husbands. A woman's desires, preferences, or feelings about potential romantic partners were not just irrelevant, they were potentially dangerous if they conflicted with the economic or political arrangements made by the men who controlled her life. Even for those fortunate enough to find genuine love within the constraints of their society, the constant threat of separation loomed large. Wars could tear lovers apart at a moment's notice, with men conscripted into armies that might march hundreds of miles away, never to return. Plagues could sweep through communities, claiming one partner while sparing the other, leaving behind only grief and memories. Economic hardship could force families to make devastating choices about which children to keep fed and which to send away. The emotional toll of such uncertainty was crushing. Imagine trying to build a loving relationship while knowing that at any moment your beloved could be accused of heresy, dragged away by soldiers, struck down by disease, or simply disappear into the vast, dangerous wilderness that lay beyond every village. The psychological stress of such constant threat would be overwhelming by any standard, yet medieval people were expected to simply accept this as the natural order of things. For those who did manage to marry, the challenges were far from over. Medieval marriages were business arrangements first and foremost, designed to consolidate wealth, secure political alliances, or ensure economic survival. Love, if it developed at all, was considered a pleasant bonus rather than the foundation of the relationship. Couples were expected to produce children quickly and frequently, regardless of their emotional connection or physical compatibility. The home itself offered little sanctuary for romantic feeling. Medieval houses were cramped, cold, and utterly lacking in privacy. Extended families, servants, and even livestock often shared the same living spaces. The idea of intimate moments between spouses was largely theoretical when children, in-laws, and farm animals were constant witnesses to every interaction. Romance requires some degree of privacy and comfort, luxuries that were virtually unknown to all but the wealthiest nobles. Even the language of love was constrained by the limited vocabulary and rigid social expectations of the time. The flowery poetry and elaborate courtship rituals that we associate with medieval romance were exclusively the province of the aristocracy, and even then, they often celebrated impossible, unrequited love rather than actual, attainable relationships. For common people, expressions of affection were necessarily simple, practical, and often coded in religious or economic terms. The seasonal rhythms of agricultural life meant that even the timing of romance was dictated by external forces. Courtship and marriage were often scheduled around planting and harvest times, with little regard for the emotional readiness or desires of the participants. Young people might find themselves betrothed during busy seasons when they had no time to get to know each other, then expected to consummate their unions during the brief lull between backbreaking periods of farm labour. Perhaps most tragically, the very brevity of medieval life meant that even successful romantic relationships were likely to be cut short. With average lifespans hovering around 30 to 40 years, and with disease, accident, and violence claiming lives with shocking regularity, Couples who managed to find genuine love and happiness together rarely had more than a decade or two to enjoy it. The constant awareness of mortality cast a shadow over every moment of joy, every tender gesture, every quiet evening spent together. The psychological impact of living under such conditions cannot be overstated. Modern research has shown us how crucial emotional security and stable relationships are to human mental health and well-being. Medieval people, denied these fundamental needs by the harsh realities of their world, often developed what we might now recognize as symptoms of chronic stress, depression, and anxiety. Yet they had no framework for understanding these feelings, no therapeutic interventions, no social support systems designed to help them cope with the emotional devastation of their circumstances. In this context, it becomes clear why so many medieval accounts of love are tinged with desperation, obsession, and tragedy. When romantic connection is both desperately needed and incredibly dangerous to pursue, when the stakes are literally life and death, when every expression of feeling must be weighed against the possibility of social destruction or eternal damnation, love becomes not a source of joy, but a source of profound anxiety and fear. This was the world that shaped medieval attitudes toward romance and relationships for centuries. A world where love was simultaneously the most human of desires and the most dangerous of pursuits, where the simple act of caring for another person could be twisted into evidence of moral corruption or supernatural influence, where the gender that was most vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft and moral failing was also expected to bear the greatest burden of romantic initiative and emotional labor. The legacy of these medieval attitudes toward love and sexuality would persist long after the Middle Ages ended, shaping Western culture's approach to romance, marriage, and gender relations for centuries to come. The idea that female sexuality is inherently dangerous, that romantic passion is morally suspect, that love should be subordinated to practical considerations, these notions, forged in the crucible of medieval hardship and superstition, would echo through the generations, influencing how people thought about relationships well into the modern era. And yet, despite all these obstacles, despite the crushing weight of social expectation and supernatural fear, despite the constant threat of death and destruction, love somehow persisted. In quiet moments stolen between the grinding demands of survival, in glances exchanged across crowded market squares, in small acts of kindness and protection, medieval people found ways to care for each other. Their love may have been constrained, threatened, and often tragically brief, but it endured nonetheless, a testament to the indomitable nature of human connection, even in the darkest of times. So we've journeyed through the grim realities of medieval Scotland, where life was indeed a brutal struggle for survival, from the endless cycle of clan warfare and blood feuds to the grinding poverty of the peasantry, from the oppressive power of the church to the devastating plagues that swept the land. It painted a picture of unrelenting hardship. But as we close this exploration of Scotland's darkest chapter, let us remember that even in those harsh times, there were glimmers of hope and humanity. The quiet dignity of the common folk who endured generation after generation, the bonds of kinship and community that sustained people through the bleakest winters, and the stubborn spirit of independence that would eventually forge a nation. The medieval Scots may have lived short, difficult lives, but their legacy endures in the very character of Scotland itself, in its fierce pride, its resilience in the face of adversity, and its unbreakable sense of identity. Their struggles were not in vain, for they laid the foundations upon which a freer, more prosperous Scotland would eventually be built. So as we drift off to sleep, let us honour the memory of those forgotten souls who came before us, and be grateful for how far we've come from those dark and desperate times.
देखो देखो
क्या कर रहा है? चला दे सही है। क्यों?
वो आके बैठा है ना टायर पे, दौड़ पड़ रहा तो वो